Hi, everyone, and welcome to this special webinar from Arthritis Consumer Experts. And today we have a very, very special guest, Dr. Mo Osman. Welcome to the studio, Dr. Osman.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah. For our audience, I'm going to give a very, very brief bio. And because I know you do talk a little bit more about who you are and what you do once you get into your webinar presentation. But I will tell them a little bit about you before we start. So Dr. Mohammed Osman is, or Mo, as we love to call him, is an associate professor, clinical scientist, and consultant rheumatologist and immunologist in the Department of Medicine at the University of Alberta. As a PhD trained rheumatologist or arthritis doc, he's passionate and committed to delving into research questions that could be life-changing for his patients. And as a person living with rheumatoid arthritis, I can tell you, Dr. Osman, this title of this talk and the slides and the information you're going to share is very relevant to a lot of different types of arthritis. So many people come to our community and talk about their fatigue, their brain fog, and obviously myriad other challenges related to their joints. But this one is a really important topic, and we're so thrilled that you're going to be sort of demystifying it for us a bit and talking about what you might be looking at in future in terms of your research program.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And thank you all for joining us today. So here are my commercial disclosures, none of which I'm going to emphasize for this talk. But a little bit about me, I'm a rheumatologist and I focus on autoimmune connective tissue diseases. So systemic sclerosis, things like skin fibrosis, lung fibrosis, in addition to things like myositis and sometimes lupus. What's a little bit, I would say, something I'm very passionate about is research. And I have a research lab, so I actually have a wet lab and I have graduate students and postdocs. And I also do a little bit of clinical research. And the focus of my research is really focused on understanding the mechanisms of fibrosis, but also understanding the mechanisms of fatigue in autoimmune diseases. And the data that I'm going to be sharing with you today is not just relevant to systemic sclerosis or scleroderma, but it's probably relevant to other autoimmune diseases. But we're using systemic sclerosis just because it is a very focused type of rare inflammatory disease, inflammatory form of inflammatory arthritis. But a lot of the thoughts that we are we have developed about systemic sclerosis are probably relevant to other forms of inflammatory arthritis. So so my talk is really divided into two talks. So the first part is the research part, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of the specific kind of things related to the research in scleroderma, and kind of finish with some of the things we're starting to do in lupus and scleroderma. And then we're going to have a second part, which is more focused on practical tips for managing fatigue in scleroderma, but also in other forms of inflammatory arthritis. And these are things that I talk to with many of my patients in clinic. So I always like to talk about a case. And in this case, we're talking about a patient who has systemic sclerosis or scleroderma. And she was diagnosed with a type called the limited cutaneous type, which just means that her skin is not very heavily involved. But what's really interesting, and this is something that I see in many, many of my patients, is that she feels exhausted. So even though on the surface her disease appears to be kind of quiescent, she is exhausted. And this is not something that is unique to scleroderma, as you may know. So this is something that we see in nearly every form of inflammatory arthritis. So we see this in rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's, lupus, and other forms of autoimmune diseases as well. So this is a common problem. And the challenging bit is, as a clinician, this is a massive unmet need. So often we don't really know how to best treat this problem for our patients because on the surface, the disease appears to be quiescent. So a little bit about what is scleroderma. So I study this disease. I run the scleroderma clinic at the University of Alberta, and this is a disease that is really characterized by blood vessel changes, inflammation, and fibrosis or scarring. And the challenging bit is, well, why is it that so many patients with scleroderma are indeed fatigued? And why is it that so many patients, even very early in their disease course, have symptoms that are comparable to things like fibromyalgia? So it's hard to kind of imagine that patients very early in their disease, even when they don't have a very aggressive, active form of their disease, have these severe debilitating symptoms, and they also have severe pain like fibromyalgia. So for us to kind of really understand this, we kind of started jumping into the literature. So one of the postdocs in the lab, Charmaine Van Aden, so she decided to actually conduct kind of a systematic review, which is just a way of kind of reviewing all the literature relevant to fatigue as it relates to scleroderma or systemic sclerosis. And what she found in this review, which was not just related to scleroderma, was also related to another form of inflammatory arthritis called ANCA vasculitis, is that really the definition of fatigue in the literature, in the medical literature, is really not well defined. So people define fatigue in various ways, and there's really little to no association with disease factors. So there are people who are fatigued when their disease is active, but many of these people continue to be fatigued even when their disease is less active. And of course, the other thing is that there are no clear guidelines related to how do you manage this problem in patients. This results in often patients feeling a little bit disgruntled and frustrated because they feel ignored. And this is not something that obviously their doctor wants to portray to them. So from this review, though, we learned that we needed to kind of better identify and define what fatigue is and really focus on the subtypes that were studied. And for us to kind of really understand what is really going on to kind of drive this, we really need to focus on a more homogeneous population of patients with and without fatigue. And this is why we focused on systemic sclerosis. This being said, this is data that Dr. Zahi Tuma presented actually at the CRA. This is from the Journal of Rheumatology, where they basically showed that fatigue was a very important indicator of poor functional profile. And there's also similar data in early arthritis from the CATCH cohort. And so this is something that is not just unique in systemic sclerosis. This is something that I think transcends many other barriers related to, many other forms of inflammatory arthritis. So in regards to fatigue and autoimmune diseases, there are generally two types of fatigue. There's the fatigue that's related to the active inflammatory disease, where when a patient sees their doctor, they're clearly flaring, or they're not diagnosed, and this is associated with very obvious indicators of disease activity. The blood work is abnormal, and generally speaking, this type of fatigue goes away when we start them on therapies that take away inflammation, like steroids or other types of um, disease-modifying agents. There's also this other type of fatigue that is the smoldering fatigue that generally is not go away even when we think the disease is under control. And this is something that is becoming more apparent and more challenging in most fields in rheumatology, even in pediatric rheumatology. So we decided to focus on the smoldering fatigue just because this type of fatigue is associated with huge amounts of disability and loss of income in patients. And what we decided to do was look at how many or how often does this type of smoldering fatigue meet the case definition for something called chronic fatigue syndrome. And chronic fatigue syndrome is not just severe fatigue because it's fatigue that lasts at least 6 months or more, and it's severe. And generally speaking, it's associated with something called post-exertional malaise or PEM, where patients feel that when they exert themselves either physically or mentally, they need days to recover. This is not something that just goes away right away. In addition, a lot of patients have something called neurological impairment, which is often referring to brain fog, where they have difficulty really remembering some things, executing things that they normally could. And I have some patients of mine with various forms of inflammatory arthritis who are very, very successful, very high functioning individuals, and they really struggle with this. So this is a big problem. So we wanted to kind of figure this out in patients with systemic sclerosis. And what we found was that nearly half of the patients with early forms of systemic sclerosis had this smoldering form of fatigue. And I'll show you data later to show you that even in patients with lupus who have a low level of disease activity, nearly half of them also have this smoldering level of fatigue. So this is a serious problem. The other thing is that many of them are female, but remember, many of the patients with scleroderma and other autoimmune diseases are also female, so there is a bias there. But what's also remarkable is that a lot of them had some changes related to the blood vessels that we are able to detect and the blood vessel abnormalities that are relevant to scleroderma, which I thought was really interesting. And we used two patient cohorts for this. We used the cohort from the University of Alberta, and these are the patients that I care for. But I also kind of needed the help for validation from patients from the Canadian Scleroderma Research Group. And just if you don't know what the CSRG is, this is a national organization of researchers across Canada where we basically have a lot of the clinical information and biological information relevant to disease and interventions and so on. And one of the things that we collect, of course, is fatigue, because we know that fatigue relates to disability, and this is why we care a lot about collecting this type of information. And what we found was both in my cohort at the University of Alberta, but also in the Canadian Scleroderma Research Group cohort, the frequency of fatigue was actually very, very high in both. But what's most impressive is that the amount of kind of this cognitive dysfunction that was present in patients with fatigue was much more common in the fatigue group than the non-fatigue group. What's also common, and this is important, is that fatigue was the biggest, this form of severe fatigue that resembles chronic fatigue syndrome was the biggest predictor of disability in both cohorts, which is really impressive to know. And this was even worse than things like the severity of skin fibrosis, which we think is really bad. But fatigue was outperforming this as far as a predictor of disability in both cohorts, which I think is very important to mention. The other thing is that, again, this is, as I mentioned, this is not something unique to scleroderma because we see this also in lupus and in patients with low level of disease activity and lupus. Their fatigue is quite bad, and it is actually also their biggest predictor of disability. So fatigue is a problem. So as a scientist, one of the things that we really wanted to identify is, well, could we identify any problems related to some of the biological pathways that are dysregulated in patients that have fatigue versus those without fatigue? Because often when patients go see a physician, they say, well, you know, your disease is well controlled. I don't know how to quantify this. So they sometimes feel that this might be in their head, but it's truly not. And this is why we decided to actually pursue an unbiased methodology called metabolomics. And what metabolomics is basically measuring all of the molecular changes and signatures that are happening because of metabolism in the blood. And we took 27 patients with severe fatigue, resembling chronic fatigue syndrome, with early disease versus 27 without. And we found that they segregated very, very nicely. So as you can see, the blue cohort here, that's the fatigue patients, and the orange one are the non-fatigue patients. And there clearly was hardly an overlap. So there were various dysregulated pathways that were present in the fatigue patients that are not present in the in the non-fatigue patients. And what's really interesting is that many of the pathways that we identified were relevant to mitochondria. And what are mitochondria? So mitochondria are the energy kind of building blocks of the cell. They are present in every cell except red blood cells, and they are responsible for making energy. And the way we measure mitochondrial dysfunction is through various ways. This particular way just shows that the mitochondria from patients with fatigue seem to be more dysfunctional. And we did this using flow cytometry. Then we actually measured things relevant to the electron transport chain, which is how mitochondria actually use energy. They use the electron transport chain to generate energy. And the patients with fatigue, generally speaking, had less functional proteins that were relevant to the electron transport chain, suggesting that perhaps there's something relevant to the energy utilization and or production that is impacting fatigue in these patients. This is not something that we came up with on our own. We actually borrowed data, or not borrowed, I should say, we read the literature, and we actually learned that in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome who have idiopathic chronic fatigue syndrome, i.e., meaning they do not have an inflammatory disease that triggers their severe fatigue, these patients have similar changes. So this is important because it tells you that a lot of these changes that could be happening in the mitochondria could also be relevant to various forms of inflammatory arthritis. So more related to scleroderma, we kind of wanted to focus on the blood vessel changes because as you remember, I mentioned the blood vessel changes are very important in scleroderma, and we identified that the number of capillaries per millimeter, which is illustrated here, is actually lower in the fatigue patients compared to the non-fatigue patients, and this is relevant to their lung function. And further to that, there were also abnormal inflammatory markers or cytokines that were present in the fatigue patients compared to the non-fatigue patients. And we identified a biomarker called galectin-9, which helps us really identify which patients are more likely to be severely fatigued. And we are very excited about this because this tells us that the patients who have higher levels of galectin-9 are probably those who are more fatigued, but also are more likely to have problems related to their oxygenation and their mitochondria. So what we are now doing is we're trying to really kind of understand and make the connections between problems related to the oxygen transport chain and how it relates to fatigue. And we're focusing on this in various autoimmune diseases, particularly scleroderma and lupus to start, just because they are in some ways more related than other types of inflammatory arthritis to each other. And we're looking at the oxygen transport chain through various techniques. And as you can see, the patients who have more challenges related to oxygen carrying, oxygen diffusion over here on the right, more likely have higher levels of galectin-9. So this is a nice biomarker that we can use potentially for clinical trials, but we also think that this pathway is potentially problematic in those with fatigue compared to those without fatigue. And again, this is not our idea. We borrowed some of this idea from stuff that has been published in patients with idiopathic fibromyalgia, but also in idiopathic chronic fatigue syndrome. And it seems like problems related to the oxygen transport chain are probably relevant to this in fibromyalgia and in chronic fatigue syndrome. So perhaps this is something that could also be dysregulated in scleroderma, lupus, and potentially in other forms of inflammatory arthritis. So this is what we are doing literally right now. So I have no data to share about this, but we are measuring problems related to this oxygen transport cascade in the brain, the heart, the muscle tissue, both at rest and exercise, and we're correlating this with mitochondrial dysfunction. And this is a grant that we're very fortunate to have support from the arthritis consumer experts, and it's currently under review with one of the funding agencies. So now that we've identified some problems related, some potential reasons for why fatigue might happen, we've kind of identified the burden of fatigue, the burden of cognitive dysfunction, we have some biomarkers. We're trying to really kind of delve into how this impacts people and how this impacts disease specifically. And we're doing this through various ways. But enough about the research, and let's talk a little bit about some of the practical tips that you as a patient may want to know about when we're dealing with fatigue. But before we kind of jump ahead, it's important to recognize our patients who are very important and instrumental in all the work that we've done, our funding organizations listed above, and of course the people who did the work, because obviously it takes a village and it's not just me or my team, it's many people who do the work. So now for some practical tips. Again, going back to our patient, she is severely fatigued. She's using various tips related to managing her fatigue. And I thought I would kind of jump into some of the things that I think work versus some of the things that probably don't work as much. So fatigue is a multifactorial problem. And as a patient, suffering from fatigue and living with fatigue, it's important to kind of recognize that there's not one real solution that will fix all issues related to fatigue. So the biggest thing I think, and this is a really nice diagram that I think I found online related to fatigue and how fatigue can be managed. I think it's very important to remember to get enough sleep. It's also important to do things that you probably should be doing anyway, which is exercise regularly, eating healthy, staying hydrated, and also kind of minimizing overbooking yourself. So I always emphasize this to my patients, kind of maintaining a diary of kind of your symptoms related to fatigue, because sometimes fatigue might be an indicator of actually something else that is related to your disease or something else that has changed about you that might be related to you and not necessarily directly to your inflammatory disease. So this could be something related to, for example, your thyroid. This could be related to issues related to medications. This could be a different problem like iron deficiency or anemia or even kind of celiac disease. Could this be because you are mentally kind of in a different place and you're struggling with mental health or other stressors? And the reason why you keep a diary is because it really can help your doctor determine, well, what changed about you? Was there, could there have been a very specific, discrete kind of moment where everything changed, or was this kind of something more insidious? Similarly, were there any associated symptoms? Well, for patients with scleroderma, could this be relevant to your disease, specifically things like your Raynaud's is changing? If you have inflammatory arthritis, for example, have you noticed that you have more morning stiffness, or have you noticed that you're getting kind of more seasonal changes related to your fatigue and your joint symptoms? Are you gaining weight or losing weight? These are all important things I think that need to be kept track of, and this is why I find the diary very helpful. The second thing I think is related to this overbooking yourself and really recognizing, your limitations and learning to say no. And I have to say, as a clinician, scientist, learning to say no has been one of my biggest challenges. So learning to say no is not an easy thing, particularly when life has to keep going on and there are many other things that are required for you to continue to do what you need to do. This is why I really like this spoon theory, which was developed actually by a neurologist for energy conservation, and whereby a patient basically you have a certain number of spoons assigned for every task, and you only kind of have that same number of spoons, and you can't get any more spoons. So if you overexert yourself and you use too many spoons, then you will not have enough spoons the next day, which means that you will be really tired and struggling with other challenges the following day. So it's important to remember this and remember that when you have periods of stress in your life that are, that happen to all of us, or if you're sick, meaning you have an infection, a cold, something like this, the number of spoons that you actually have diminish. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you're kind of planning ahead and talking to your loved ones, and also kind of working with them so that they understand that this is not something that is going to kind of be complementary with your challenges related to fatigue. The final thing is really scheduling breaks. And I personally do this, and people make fun of me for doing this, but I actually schedule naps in the middle of the day. And as a scientist, I studied this problem, of course, and I wanted to determine what was the ideal nap time for me was. And for me, it's actually about 35 minutes. So it says take short naps to 20 to 35 minutes. And this has actually been studied, and they have many profound cardiovascular benefits in addition to productivity benefits. And these naps are in addition to your regular, 7 to 10 hours of sleep that you may have. And this is important that you kind of incorporate this in addition to your bedtime routine, which is avoiding kind of stimuli or caffeine after a certain period of time. And people forget to do this, especially when they're dealing with deadlines and things like this. But I think this is important. And the reason why this is important to have a scheduled routine is because there is something called the circadian rhythm and the cycle, and this really does change depending on the time of day that you're on. And the thing that changes is this thing called melatonin, which is actually a neurotropic hormone that your body releases that really helps you regulate the antioxidant kind of properties present in your body, but also kind of your sleep cycle. And what people have recommended is actually taking more melatonin to help you really sleep. And what's really interesting is that in our metabolomic screen that we identified, things that were relevant to higher levels of reactive oxygen species were much more elevated in the fatigue patients, showing that when you take antioxidants like vitamin C and melatonin, those potentially could be really useful for helping you manage your fatigue. So it's not completely, based on no data. It's actually based on data that we think is relevant from our lab, and we think that this is something that could be useful. Exercise is something that a lot of people talk about, but the challenge is, well, how much exercise should someone do? What type of exercise should people do? Should you do exercise that is more kind of aerobic exercise or other types of exercise? And there was a really nice study that was published looking at this. It's called the PACE trial. And what they did was they looked at basically treatment with exercise that was standardized versus the treatment with standardized exercise that is adaptive pacing, i.e., you kind of change the number of spoons, versus standardized exercise with cognitive behavioral therapy to basically avoiding certain to minimize avoidance of certain activities, and then exercise with graded exercise therapy. And only the patients really that were the jury's still out, because when patients received this treatment, they basically had only about 22% of them improved even after the 2-year follow-up. The thing to remember, though, is that if you have this post-exertional malaise that I was describing, that is, as you may recall, very common in patients with inflammatory arthritis, so lupus and in scleroderma. We've measured this, but we don't know in other forms of inflammatory arthritis, but probably also present. It's really hard to kind of do these types of interventions. So I think the jury is still out about how to kind of book this exercise and how to schedule this exercise in a way that is complementary to managing fatigue. Um, Eating healthy is important, and everybody talks about the low FODMAP diet. And the jury is still out, I would say, in how this is relevant to fatigue. In scleroderma, this is particularly relevant because a lot of people have referred to the microbiome as being a very important component that is dysregulated early that contributes to fatigue. And we know that patients with scleroderma generally have severe GI manifestations and GI problems. And what's interesting is that they have a more restricted microbiome, which we think is more associated with inflammation. And this is not just unique to scleroderma, because this is also present in other forms of inflammatory diseases. When people tried a low-fat FODMAP diet, which is something that you have to work with a dietitian, because this is something that can be a little bit restrictive for some people, they actually did not notice a difference in the scleroderma patients related to the microbiome diversity. So whether this actually means that they did this for long enough, or it was too late because the microbiome has already been established, or and therefore it may not change as quickly, is hard to say. But I think the jury is still out. So the best thing to do is really to kind of keep a diary of what you eat, and work closely with someone who kind of understands this and with yourself, so that you can actually monitor your symptoms and introduce or eliminate things as need be. And I have to say, anecdotally, many of my patients have done this, and they have said, "Oh, Dr. Osman, when I've tried doing this, this is really not something that works with my body, and I avoid this for those reasons." Probiotics can help, and people have done this in patients with long COVID. And I've indicated the companies that have some more data, and this is a nice review and relevant to scleroderma. If you're interested, that you can kind of look into it. And last but not least, vitamin D. So I'm a huge supporter of taking vitamin D. especially if your vitamin D levels are low, which applies to, I would say, most Canadians because we live in the northern part of the northern hemisphere. And generally speaking, when people have low levels of vitamin D, particularly lower than 20, their probability of improving with higher doses of vitamin D with regards to their fatigue and or their pain is actually higher. So this is a very nice study. It's a Dutch study that was now it's older. It's almost 10 years old. But what they did was they took patients who actually had idiopathic chronic fatigue syndrome and they measured their baseline vitamin D levels. And they did a randomization. And what they did was they either gave placebo or high doses of vitamin D. And what is high dose? That's about 100,000 units once for about 1 month, and then they stopped. And then they measured fatigue levels in these patients. And again, this was a self-reported PRO, patient-reported outcome. And they found that the levels of fatigue actually decreased in the patients who were given vitamin D. What do I do in clinical practice? I generally measure baseline vitamin D levels and I monitor vitamin D levels and things like calcium levels for toxicity. And I supplement my patients with 50,000 units once a week. And in some of my patients, not all of them, they do seem to have an improvement related to this. So the bottom line is, there's a lot that's happening with fatigue, and it's very, very multifactorial. Generally speaking, you have to customize your approach, and there's no cookie cutter approach for every patient. It's important to make sure your disease is not active before you start kind of thinking about what else could you do. And I think really understanding some of these biological things that are happening at the kind of subcellular and microscopic levels are important for us to kind of really understand what's going on with fatigue so that we can better manage it.
Holy smokes. That is an amazing overview, first of all, from the biological side of things, Dr. Osman, but also I know that our audience is going to really appreciate part two, which is, where the rubber hits the road. I think between you and your patient or people that are out there experiencing these diseases. Um, one of the things that you talked about was smoldering fatigue, and this is your specific area of interest because it seems like fatigue can be managed when, in fact, markers are low and disease control is relatively good. Am I getting that right? And that smoldering fatigue, you have less clues about why the fatigue exists.
That's right. So you're absolutely right, Cheryl. So there are, as I kind of very simplistically,
Yeah,
broadly categorize them. But when patients are very active, they're exhausted. They can't do anything. They feel like they have the flu. They can't get out of bed. They are miserable. And it's amazing when, they see a rheumatologist and all of a sudden things are like, they click and they're like, oh, well, actually, this is what you have. Let's try to fix this. And then they get therapy that would be appropriate for them. And, different
yeah,
diseases have different types of therapies. And when their disease gets under control, a lot of these patients feel better.
right,
However, there are also a large proportion of patients that don't, right? And this is kind of what sparked this research interest that we have in within my group. So I have to say, like, this is something that I was inspired by one of my mentors, Jan Willem Cohen-Tervert. He brought this to my attention, and I paid a lot of attention to this since. And now it's half of the research program that happens in my lab was inspired by this. So I have to say, this is driven initially by the spark that he created, but it's primarily motivated by my patients. So a lot of my patients have this type of problem, and obviously figuring out why is important, particularly for me. If I have a nice homogeneous population of patients with scleroderma, but obviously this is not something that's just relevant to scleroderma. As you see, it's relevant to nearly every form of inflammatory arthritis and possibly also other autoimmune diseases.
yeah. It's interesting as you learn to live with your disease, and I speak as a person with rheumatoid arthritis over 35 years, you get used to managing the joint issues. right? If a joint is flaring or you're in pain, you can have a supportive device, you can have a brace, you can rest it, you can do these things. But it's really difficult to sort of get at the fatigue piece. So I was really happy to see that overview slide, which is a great reminder, even for people like me who've had disease for a long, long time, Dr. Osman, to do some of those very basic things. And thank you for sharing your own personal nap habit. We really like that. And I'm going to start thinking about nap time myself. But to understand what that rest cycle should look like, I mean, it's different for every person, obviously. But when people get diagnosed, and especially when they're working, as many, I'm sure, of your patients are, as many of our community members are, you kind of feel guilty in the middle of the day if you're at your job to say, okay, well, I've got to go have a rest. But if that's what it takes in order to be fully productive and have less fatigue in your life, we should do it.
I completely agree with that. So, this is where kind of understanding and planning is very important,
Yeah,
right? So whether it's, planning naps, planning, activities, planning, meals, all these things are very, very important. And it's also kind of reminding yourself that, it's okay to not, keep pushing yourself. It's
yeah,
it's okay,
yeah.
right? So I think that's important, and it's not a form of weakness to kind of realize your limitations.
And then in that planning and sort of calibrating activity, you also have to layer on top of that as you age. And as
That's
we
it.
age, we don't have the same stamina. Regrettably, I'm learning this myself. Um, but it's a fascinating sort of dance between, what I call other people or normal people, people who aren't living with a type of autoimmune disease are having to deal with. And then you lie under that, the disease state, and it becomes obviously more complicated and a bit more challenging. I'm curious to know, you thanked your patients at the end of part one for participating in your research program, which is fantastic. If someone has watched this and wants to get involved in some of your research, if they want to be perhaps an informed consumer or research participant as a team member or as an informant to how you develop your research, how does one go about doing that?
So it's complicated.
Yeah,
The reason why it's complicated is because, when someone is participating in just the research, and um, it's a completely different kind of system or model than if I was seeing them as their physician. But this is something that we have made happen. So the research that we're interested in is related to, as I mentioned before, the pathogenesis
yeah.
and pathophysiology of fibrosis, scarring, and scleroderma, but also this fatigue. And the funding that we have is relevant to fatigue in scleroderma, but also in lupus, right? So very, very fortunate to receive a Catalyst Award from Lupus Canada. And now we're able to kind of explore this in lupus. So we are a little bit restricted just because we don't have unlimited dollars. And we have to try to stretch these dollars as much as we can, but we do make exceptions every now and then. Okay.
Okay, okay.
So
Well,
that's the plan.
if people are interested, we can always field their comments and pass them on.
Of course.
Yeah. Another quick question before we let you go. You showed that terrific diagram about how how a person's body uses the oxygen. So it's that oxygen throughput. You talked about the importance of exercise. Is that making a difference? Like, do you see people engaging in exercise and in the lab that changes their
So we
ability
haven't.
to use oxygen?
So we haven't done that yet, but this is something that we are planning on doing.
Yeah.
So we are requesting funding for this, right? Because this is we have to do this the proper way, otherwise we can't derive conclusions. However, anecdotally, some of my patients who have kind of embarked on a very structured exercise program have mentioned to me that they feel markedly better with regards to their fatigue. So they feel like they can do more. They're still fatigued. They still have a little bit of kind of that brain fog, as compared to their normal self. But the amount of stuff that they can actually get done in a given day is a lot more than before. Which and the severity of the PEM, this post-exertional malaise that they have, is also a lot less. So it's something that I think there's something there, and how this is working and why it's working, we don't know yet. But I think it's something that we have to kind of explore further.
Sounds like another piece of research on deck for you.
Yes, for sure. No, it's
Yeah,
actually very exciting, and this is something that we are planning on doing.
terrific. And I'm going to close with this question. So, having been in the arthritis community for a long while and worked with researchers as a patient partner and as an organizational leader, I am acutely aware of the challenges of underfunding in arthritis research. There's for the burden that all of arthritis, which the diseases you talked about fall under that umbrella. Um, is it worse for these more rare forms of disease, Dr. Osman? Is it lower than low, the research
So,
funding?
so funding rare diseases is not easy, right? And the reason why it's not easy is because number one, there's just less people donating, I guess, for that purpose. The second thing is that generally speaking, the government, the pots for government funding are just not as big. So I mean, I'm not saying that it's not important in any way. So funding cancer research is very important, but there's a lot of money that goes into funding cancer research
Yeah, yeah,
in comparison to things like inflammatory arthritis or some of the other kind of rarer problems, right? So it becomes a little bit challenging. So sometimes you have to be creative as a researcher, but also we're always very happy and fortunate when we have amazing donors and patient organizations who kind of champion this. And this is important because this allows researchers like myself to generate kind of the instrumental pilot data, which you can sometimes take to kind of a big funding organization and say, hey guys, you know, we have this data, it's pretty convincing. Can you give us some money? And through the whole, back and forth, eventually, if you're lucky, they'll give you some money, and then you can actually do some pretty good work.
yeah. Well, you've always got us in your corner, Dr. Osman. If you need letters of support, we just think your work is incredible. We also think it has a much broader application than these more what I call niche or rare diseases compared to some of the other forms of arthritis. But sometimes that's where we need to start kind of unraveling some of these things in the lab. And last question, wet lab. Describe what that is.
So wet lab is when you can take either blood from people or you can take cells. So one of the things that my lab does on a regular basis is we study fibroblasts, which are the cells that cause scarring, and we study immune cells in the lab under the microscope, under fancy machines called flow cytometers, or we study them under the microscope. Literally, we stare at them after we kind of do different things to them. So this is kind of what a wet lab is. In addition to that, we run like these things that call gels. So you may see like on CSI, see what CSI. I'm dating myself, I think, but yeah. So you see these like agarose gels. We don't do this anymore for sequencing, but you can actually purify proteins, clone proteins, manipulate, change proteins, things like that.
Yeah,
So if you're interested in a specific biological pathway,
very
so
cool.
yeah.
Okay, the CSI of Alberta, of the University of Alberta, maybe that's going to be their next new series. I guess lastly, when I was listening to you speak, Dr. Osman, it kept striking me that the patients that you're seeing in your clinic, but also through your research program, I guess at the end of the day, we're all sort of ends of one. We're all these snowflakes, and the work that you're doing is getting at sort of personalized medicine. The more you can tease apart some of these things, like what is smoldering fatigue and who gets it and how and why, versus someone who doesn't, will help you clinically deal with person by person. Is that a true kind of statement, or is that kind of what you're working towards, much like they have in cancer? They know if you detect a certain gene, there's a certain treatment. do you feel you're heading in that direction?
So when it comes to the fatigue research, I would say we are still kind of in its infancy. We are
Okay.
still really kind of unraveling things at a kind of an infancy level. In the
Okay.
fibrosis stuff that we're doing, I would say absolutely. So we have identified specific proteins, for example, where we can say that if this person has this disease and they have this type of protein with this type of carbohydrate modification, they're more likely to have a worse outcome. So we need
Okay.
to so we are already there when it comes to kind of the more like fibrosis stuff in scleroderma. With the fatigue stuff, we are just literally scratching the surface because not many groups in the world actually are actually interested in figuring this out. And the fact that we can identify biological pathways that are dysregulated, and now we're kind of trying to tease that out a little bit more, is huge.
Well, I can tell you from the community that I live and work in, we also think it's huge. So you keep going, because fatigue has a massive impact on our lives. And it's something that is, as you've pointed out in your talk, under-researched, not necessarily recognized in the clinic, in the conversation that we have with our physicians. But we hope it becomes not just a mainstay, but a big part of our clinical discussion with extremely trained doctors like yourself. So we want to thank you so much, Dr. Osman, for your time. This was hugely illuminating. I know we're going to have lots of questions following. We'll do our best to answer those, but for those that we don't have answers for, we might fire them over to you and ask for some quick replies that we can deal with our inbox. So we just want to thank you very much. We wish you the very best, and we will be talking again with you soon. And to our viewers, we want to thank you for tuning in. At the end here, we're going to provide you with an address that you can write to. We'll also provide you with some additional links to Dr. Osman's work that have been published, as well as to materials that Arthritis Consumer Experts has on managing fatigue. So thank you, and we'll see you again very soon. Thank you, Dr. Osman.
Thank you, Cheryl.